Hey, welcome back, everybody. George Palaio, great to be with you guys today on the JP Podcast, and we have Vicki Hagadorn. I know your last name because your husband's here with us, but we also had him on one of the shows.
Yeah.
And we're excited to have you. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Thank you. So for those of you guys that don't know who Vicki is, they run I want to say not a company, but an organization more so for grief recovery. And so when we were speaking with Dan, the conversation came up on how a lot of people don't know how to talk about grief or walk through grief with somebody. And it's not really a topic that's talked about, you know? You get into these situations and you're like, man, I'm really sorry to hear that. Or is there anything you need from me? Or I'll pray for you. And it's just like, how do you walk people through some of the most difficult moments of their life? What do you say? What's the right thing to say, wrong thing to say? Why do we respond that way? Because we don't necessarily know how to respond. And so Shane highly recommended you, Vicki, in terms of just who you and your husband are as people. And there's an energy that you get that you guys just love people. And that's like instant, by the way, now that I know your husband, but when I got a chance to meet you. And so we're excited to have you on.
Thank you so much.
So tell us, how you got, I know we talked a little bit off camera, but how you got into being in grief recovery. Why did you choose that as a calling, as a purpose? Did it choose you? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I would love to. It was, I was an adult, I was a grown up, and I was married, and I didn't live at home. And I say that because I went through my parents getting divorced, and it rocked my world. And I had gone through a lot of therapy, and I had been in quite a bit of recovery all through my 20s and 30s. And I realized that I did not have the tools to process this loss. It felt like the rug got pulled out from underneath me. And a good friend of mine had just lost her sister and had gone through the grief recovery method and said, I think this would really help you. And my first response was, I don't need that. I don't need grief recovery. Because I think, like a lot of people, like you said, I first of all didn't realize I was grieving. And so I went to a meeting to learn about what the grief recovery method was. And that's where I learned the definition of grief. And the first thing I heard was that unresolved grief is the end of a familiar pattern of behavior. And it's conflicting feelings that are caused by that. And when you think about
Say that again, unresolved grief.
Yes, unresolved grief is conflicting feelings caused by the end of a familiar pattern of behavior. So when you think about it that way, you kind of realize how many things are grief. When you are losses, when you move, when you change jobs, when you graduate from school, when your kids move out, like there's all these things that are end of familiar patterns of behavior, and they bring conflicting feelings. And so those feelings can be where you're happy and sad at the same time, and you don't even know what you're feeling. You can't even put a word to it. And I remember being at this meeting and learning about grief and realizing I've literally been grieving my whole life. And I've been through so much therapy, thousands of dollars of therapy, to try to learn how to process it. And nothing actually helped me do that until I went through this process. And it was so life-changing in such a short amount of time that I knew this is what I'm meant to do.
What's the difference between that process that you went through and through therapy?
I think the main difference is it's an action program. So there's a start and an end. And with, I'm not here to bag on therapy at all. I think that there's a place. But for me, my experience was this is an action program, meaning that what you're really doing is you're getting tools. You're learning how to process grief, loss, trauma. And on the way of doing that, you really end the process with tools to process through grief and loss, because sadly, we're guaranteed to experience that, just even in great ways when, like you have young kids as they grow up and you go through different phases of life. I always say that these are transitions. Transitions bring about grief. They bring about all these feelings. So we want to learn how to process them in an emotionally healthy way in order to be present as moms, as spouses, as employers, as employees, like all of those things.
What are the most common? So if I'm watching this and I'm like, well, we all go through challenges, like whether it's a relationship or loss of somebody that you love, or loss of whether that's a friend or a partner in life. your parents go through things. Maybe it's a divorce.
Yeah.
You go through financial, setbacks, and you lose everything. There's all different kinds of situations. What would you see that are the most common forms of grief or situations that cause grief for people?
Wow. I think, I think death and divorce are definitely the two that bring people to reach out for something like this program. And those are big ones. And then I think what happens is when you start doing the work, you realize, oh my gosh, there's a lot. Like, for instance, when I first came, I thought, I don't really need this. I haven't had a lot of loss as far as death in my life. And I thought this would be really good for Dan. He's had a lot of traumatic loss. I didn't really know if it would apply to me. And then you sit down and you kind of take a really good look at your life, because you want to kind of see, what are the losses that I've had? How have I learned how to process those? Because those coping mechanisms are what I've brought in as an adult. And a lot of them don't really serve you to process things in emotionally healthy ways. And so I would say that the big ones are death and divorce. And then when you get in, you realize that there have been a lot of things along the way that have kind of established unhealthy coping mechanisms.
A lot of micro trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. In running a business, oftentimes you don't get to say, like, how do I feel about this and what's going on and you're like, dude, next, let's go. Mental toughness, toughen up, buddy. Like, don't be so emotional.
Yes.
And I'll tell you, like, as an entrepreneur, like, you sometimes have to turn that off.
Absolutely.
To be able, like, to execute, and you lose a little bit of that empathy, or sympathy. So, and that'll be one of my questions, like, how to be a top performer and still be, empathetic and help people go through that. You said death and divorce, and then you said coping mechanisms. What are the most common coping mechanisms on how people deal with death and divorce that you see that are unhealthy?
I would say the main ones are addictions. So drinking, using drugs, gambling, shopping, there's all kinds of things that you can do to even just scrolling, checking out, from things that can start out kind of small as ways to just sort of let the steam out, then that can turn into full-blown addictions. I really have a strong, conviction that underneath almost all addiction is unresolved grief. And so it's a very important part of a process of recovery is dealing with your unresolved grief. Huge.
And I would think that most people don't connect it to that.
Mm-mm.
There's like a stigma on that today, like, as well, like, especially for men. I would say more so. Women, like, it's easier to talk to each other. Guys are like, I'm not gonna talk about the stuff that went wrong with, growing up as a kid. Everybody had stuff wrong growing up as a kid.
Exactly.
So then you're at this course, you're there, you're starting to identify that you've dealt with these different situations. It's giving you a strategy. What are some things? So if somebody's going through grief, they're going through a divorce, they're going through death right now at this moment, what can they do at this very moment?
Well, I think that, let's see. Well, if you're going through something, I would say that okay, here's another definition of unresolved grief. So unresolved grief is undelivered communication of an emotional nature. Undelivered communication? Of an emotional nature.
Okay.
So when you think of that, you think what's undelivered communication is I need to talk. I need to process. And so a lot of times it can even be something as simple as, being able to have a moment. Let's say you just lost someone that you're very close to, and you're able to just sit down and someone asks, tell me about, let's say it's your grandfather. Tell me about your grandfather. What are your best memories? Depending on how close you are, obviously, to the person, but giving someone the space to be able to just share their heart without, and this is the important thing, is there are over, I don't know how they figured this out, but 150 things that people say at times of loss that are not helpful.
Such as
they're in a better place. At least they're not in pain anymore. A lot of the times what we've learned how to do to help someone through loss is intellectualize. is intellectualize these emotions because we want to tie it up. We want to help them feel better in the moment. And we kind of are adverse to just letting them cry or letting them feel. And so when we do that, when we give someone that kind of an intellectual answer to their emotions, what we're doing is we're minimizing what they're feeling, and we're giving them kind of an unsaid, we're telling them basically, this isn't really, don't really talk about it, just they're in a better place. Or if you have religion, a lot of times people will say, well, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, which is a terrible thing to say to somebody, especially when they're grieving, because it's not even scripturally sound. It's not true. There's many things in life that we will have to handle, and we don't have the capacity to do it on our own strength. So it goes actually against what the Bible teaches, but it also leaves you with this very confusing feeling of, well, what kind of God, whatever God, fine, I can't handle this. Or, you start to feel bad about feeling bad. And then you're dealing with double, like I don't even know how to handle this right. Like I'm just better off to numb out and not feel this.
Wow. Yeah, that's something I don't know what to say. When somebody tells me they lose somebody.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for your loss. I pray their soul's in heaven. Like, is there something that you need? But like, I don't feel like that's the right answer as well, because is there something that you need? Like, most of the time they say, no, I'm okay, and you don't.
Right.
Well, and then you say, well, if you want to talk, I'm here if you want to talk. But like, that person is not. Most of us don't want to call somebody to like unload on them.
Right.
So even though I probably need to talk, I'm probably not going to call you.
Right.
In that case, what's a better way of dealing with that?
I think that, by telling someone that you're sorry for their loss is a great thing. I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now, like kind of open-ended. Because even if you've had a similar loss, like let's say you've lost your dad and someone has just lost their dad, your relationship with your dad is 100% unique to you. Someone might have lost their dad who they talk to every day. Someone might have lost their dad that they haven't spoken to in years. And what goes along with that is the loss of the hope of it ever, and which one is worse, right? Which one you can't compare. And so you can't ever even, I know exactly how you feel. You don't. Like we always say, don't ever say that to someone because it's so minimizing. You don't know how someone feels because everybody's relationship is unique. Even a twin brother would have a different relationship with a parent, And so it's a very interesting, and it is a tricky thing because we don't know what to say, but a lot of times just acknowledging, I can't even imagine, letting someone know that you're there for them, and then following up. Maybe the next day or in the next couple days, send a text, or do you want to meet for coffee, or, something like that.
Yeah, inviting them to spend time or
Yes.
Okay. And in that, when you're having a conversation, is it unhealthy for that person? Because you're going to bring up pain, right? Like, hey, tell me more about, that do you dive into that? Because I feel like that's the stuff people don't want to dive into. Like, what was it like? What was your relationship with them? What's your, like, I wouldn't even know what to necessarily ask in that moment when we're getting together for coffee. What does somebody ask?
I think asking the how are you doing, like kind of the general things, how are you doing? And sometimes you're right, people don't want to, but once they do, you'll be amazed at how much they just start talking. And it's making me think about when we do, one of the first things that we talk about the first week in the course of grief recovery is, what are some of the myths that you've learned about grief and loss, like growing up? And there's 6 kind of major ones that we talk about that kind of everything falls under. And the one big one is like, don't feel bad, time heals, keep busy, replace the loss. These are things that we tend to have learned. Either we were told that, or maybe maybe you lost your dog and then the next couple days later you got a new dog. Like things that you just kind of learned growing up. So there's a lot of things that we realize when we don't say those things and we open up the space that people just start really talking. So there was this one woman that I was working with, and we just had gone through that part of it, and she was at work the next day, and one of the guys that she worked with got the news that his dad had passed, and it was devastating. And all the coworkers were going in, and she was like, and I was hearing all of them say all the things like, he's not in pain, he's in a better place. And she said, and I just said to him, I can't imagine if you ever want to talk, I'm here. And she said, and he actually DM'd me and asked if we would go to lunch. She's like, we've never gone to lunch before. And they went to lunch, and she said he spent the whole hour just talking about his dad. And afterwards, he was just like, wow, just that safe place that, to be able to share that. Whew, like, you don't even realize that that's on your heart. So when you start talking about it, it really gives you that, like, sometimes we don't even know that's what we need. Most of the time we don't. Yeah.
You don't have too many people to talk to. You just go inward versus being able to have somebody to share with. Yeah.
Because a lot of times when you have talked, you've been given those kinds of platitude answers. Well, they're in a better place. And imagine that what that does is it just shuts you down, because you get that message. Yeah, you know what? I'm really not supposed to talk about this.
When I had a conversation with Dan, and he talked about, you don't know really what to say. So you don't even, people just like, all right, well, if you need something, I'm sorry. And I had a situation where this happened the other day. And it was, instead of that, from that conversation with Dan, it was, what role did this person play in your life? Like, and then this person went on to share a lot of happy memories.
Yeah.
And it was like, it was the first time ever that I've asked a person a question versus just giving them, if you need to talk, let me know. Because I would lean away from it out of the discomfort, but I also would communicate with them because I wanted them to know I care, but I didn't know how to be that person to allow them to talk. So that makes a lot of sense of being there to give people an outlet.
Yes,
to speak
definitely.
and listen.
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan is king of knowing how to ask questions.
And then what about divorce? For people that have been through divorce, is it the same concept of just being there to be able to listen, different questions to ask? Is it a different process? Is it similar?
I would say it's similar in the way that they're going through like the end of a familiar pattern of behavior, and they're going through the end of that. It's a little different because it's depending on, sometimes they can be very tumultuous. Sometimes there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of, pain. There's a lot of sad, hurt, and all those things. I think that anytime that you can just be what we say, a heart with ears, and that's someone that can be present. And I don't have an opinion on what you're going through. I'm just here to listen and be a safe place for you to just process and vent sometimes, to be able to vent.
Got it. In terms of therapy versus grief, like how a therapist would go about that and grief, what would you say is the main difference between those two?
I think the main thing is that grief recovery it's an action program. So we start, you're going to start and finish it honestly in 7 weeks. And then so it's 8 weeks. And the 8th week is a follow-up, like a coaching. Okay, how do you use these tools moving forward? How do we move forward? So it's a very distinct amount of time versus sometimes therapy. There's a lot of sessions of discovery and different things. So we do quite a bit in a short amount of time, and it's very structured. So we're there to really help you get connected to your emotional truth about the way you've learned how to process grief and loss, the examples that you've had, and then a specific relationship. So what we usually end up doing is focus on a foundational relationship in your life. So sometimes someone might come and maybe they're going through a divorce, let's say. We usually will start where let's start back to a foundational relationship, which is usually one of your parents. Because you want to start with, where did you learn how to process grief and loss? What was modeled for you? So we're about kind of like going to the root of things, which is different than kind of sitting in therapy and talking, which has its place. This is definitely different.
Got it. What do you see happens to people when they don't know how to deal with grief? Because I think if they knew how to deal with it, they'd want to deal with it. People don't want to live with torture, or live with frustration or sadness or any of these things. What do you see happens to people when they don't deal with it, the consequence of not dealing with it?
Ooh, I think that the consequences of not dealing with it usually end up that you're isolated and alone. At some point, depending on if you're like a high achieving person and you're goal driven and you're going to build a business and work, you don't want to have a business and not have a family, and lose your relationships because you don't know how to stop and engage. And you keep, using these coping mechanisms to keep going until you look around and see, oh, I've kind of, when you numb out your emotions and just go forward, there's a lot of things that happen that you lose along the way. I think addiction is a big one. People can go full blown into addiction and they just kind of go inward and numb out, and they can't, the longer that you go, the less you can kind of handle. And then you end up in the hospital, or you end up medicated, or it just kind of tends to keep getting worse and worse and worse. And I think ultimately, we talk about this a lot too, is that unresolved grief is a lot of times underneath your body will physically manifest, and you'll get sick. You'll get, when my parents were getting divorced, I got adult onset asthma. I had never had asthma in my life, and all of a sudden I'm in the doctor's trying to figure out, and I remember the doctor saying to me, a holistic doctor said, lungs are grief. Lungs represent grief. And I remember being like, oh, that's weird. Like, I didn't even connect. It did not even connect until after I had gone through the grief recovery process and went, oh my gosh, I was grieving. So it will affect, it will manifest itself physically, and then you can get illness, and then you end up dealing with that. Then that becomes like the presenting thing. Then you're dealing with the illness. And so I think when you say what's the long term, is I think it's, your life of health in all these different areas, emotional, physical, all these things.
I'm assuming that affects you the most in outside of your relationship with yourself, with your spouse, in terms of how you go through challenges in the marriage.
Yes.
Because if you have anxiety or stress or challenges that you haven't dealt with, you're carrying that around.
Yes.
And then they're carrying their stuff around, and then you add kids to the mix, and there's the pressure of being a great parent and balancing your work life and your marriage and your child. Do you see that most people that they don't seek this out until there's some kind of catastrophe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what advice do you give to a person that's maybe doesn't have an active death or a recent divorce or something that's watching this, where they're like, what should somebody that's watching this do to go examine if they have areas that they're unaware that are affecting them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish everybody would do it. I wish this would be a kind of emotional growth 101 in a way. This is the course on emotional maturity to me. A lot of the things that Dan and I do together, our heart is parents and our heart's family. So it's about that. And I remember, because when I went through grief recovery at that age, and Dan and I had been just married for about 4 years, and I went through the process because of my parents' divorce. But when I noticed the value in it was the difference in my marriage, which is not why I went, right?
How did it affect your marriage?
It affected my marriage because our communication changed so drastically after I went through the process. Because as I was getting healing on the foundational relationship with my parents, I realized that's what my marriage was built on. My way of communicating with my husband had a lot to do with the way that I saw my parents communicate growing up. And there was a lot of growth that had happened. I grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom was codependent to the extreme. And I was kind of I was half and half. I'm 32 years sober. At the time that I went through grief recovery, I was 10 years sober. So there was a lot of, like I said, recovery under my belt. But I didn't know, our marriage, our communication, when things would happen and conflict would happen, I would just shut down. And it would take me days to figure out how I felt. And he's a very patient man, but I really tested, and he was very patient with me. But I remember after doing grief recovery, I remember having a conversation and realizing I know what I'm feeling in the moment. And I'm actually able to say, oh, this is how I'm feeling, and have an opinion, like in my therapy, I had gone through a lot of therapy. I had dealt with addiction. I had also dealt with a very severe eating disorder through all of my 20s. So I was in very intensive therapy. And the theme of it was always boundaries and codependency and, all these things that I had all this head knowledge of. But when the moments would happen where I was triggered, all of that went out the window. And I went into protection mode, just like I had done my whole life. It was just like, shut down, don't say anything, don't make anybody mad. How do I feel? I have no idea how I feel, because I've learned to look through a lens of how everybody else in the room is feeling. Mm-hmm. And I never really believed that would change, because I had done a lot of therapy and it never did. I was doing my best to kind of live where that wasn't running my life. I had a very strong, I didn't struggle with any of those things anymore. But I knew I don't have the tools to process this. And when I could tell you that I was in a conversation with my husband, and all of a sudden I was like, I'm able to know what I'm feeling in the moment. I'm able to have boundaries. I'm able to understand how it was like, that's when I said, this is different than anything I've done. This was able to somehow get to the root of something that I didn't even believe could ever actually really change. I always say this to people when we first start talking about grief recovery is, you are like a fruit producing tree. That's who we are as people, right? We produce fruit in our life. And when we want to change the fruit, we tend to prune a tree. And you can prune a tree all day long. You're always going to get the same fruit back until you dig up the root and plant in new seed. And then you're going to get new fruit. And if your fruit is that you have, from codependent behaviors, not knowing how you feel about something, or addictive behaviors, self-sabotaging, all the different things, it's very possible to go in, dig up the root, and that's what we do. And that's what we commit to together. We're in it totally with you, 100% the whole way. And I always say, trust me, because I know that this works. I'm here to facilitate this with you, with the belief that I know how powerful this is. And I also know from my own experience that the change that happened in my marriage and in my ability to be present. We always say that's like a bonus, that you get to be present in the moment. To be present in the moment with your spouse or your kids, instead of being triggered by something from your past that you don't even really know what's going on, but all of a sudden you're so shut down you can't engage. And if someone asked you, how do you feel, you wouldn't even know what to say.
My first argument with my wife, we were dating at the time, and we laugh about it now, but in the moment, she had made dinner, and so I was like cleaning the dishes, and I left all kinds of water around the sink, and and she said something to me like, why would you leave all, or she says, aren't you going to dry that something? And it was so small that it just triggered me, because I'm like, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to like I'm washing the dishes, like what,
Right.
And at that moment I said, and I had come out of a relationship, just things didn't go right, and wish the best for the person, but there was being disrespected or being talked to a certain way. And so now I'm with my wife, and it just triggered this moment of like, this is the first, and I said this to her, it wasn't like a proud moment either, this is the first and last time you're going to speak to me that way. And then she completely like shut down. Mm-hmm. So this is awkward now, because we're still dating at the time. It's like our fifth, sixth date, and I'm like at her place, and so I'm like, do you want me to leave? And she's like, and that probably would have been where our relationship ended if she said yes. She says, no, why would I want you to leave? Just because we're not like, just because I'm upset doesn't mean I want you to leave, And then we ended up talking, and it ended up being that two people were triggered. I was triggered on the disrespect because I felt that way.
Right.
So I'm like, no, I don't accept that, because it's my mechanism of defending myself. She was triggered in terms of just her relationship with her dad on certain ways that he spoke to her. So both people were triggered. Nobody was able to like identify in that moment what emotion happened, why it happened, And so it's like couples, I'm assuming, like if they don't deal with their stuff, then an argument happens. They're both trying to defend themselves, and they don't know how to have a good argument or a healthy conversation. I would assume like vulnerability, people look at vulnerability as like a weakness. Like man, I don't want to be soft. I don't want, especially
Right.
more of a guy. I can speak for me. Like, I don't want to be, vulnerable. But I think it requires like real maturity as a human being to be vulnerable and to really trust that person in that process. And it's hard because that's not really taught in marriage, or in
No, not
in
at
life.
all.
You don't see your parents argue that way.
No,
You don't
not
see,
at all.
hey, this bothered me because, yelling or leaving. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like what you said, you were triggered by this relationship from before. She was triggered by her dad, and that's what it is. Like that's why we all like I'll say if somebody comes in and they're dealing maybe with divorce or something, we will first look at your whole life. You look at your life and you look at what we call a loss history graph. So you're going to look at the losses that you've experienced, and from that we figure out where we start. And the a relationship or a marriage is what's built on top of this foundation. So you can, get help for those things, but until you deal with this stuff. And what I love is that it brings clarity. So in the moment you could go, okay, and you kind of figure out what works for you as a couple. I need to step away right now and kind of process this. You have the tools to do that, to recognize, okay, I'm being triggered by this. Let me go back and then you can come back and say, wow, that really triggered me because I've been, and you can actually come together and talk to each other with honor and respect. And that's not an easy thing for sure. And it definitely takes vulnerability.
yeah,
But the willingness.
yeah. There's no wonder why divorce is so high.
Oh yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's not like you don't learn. There's not like a class on how to be a great husband and wife or have a great marriage. Like if you don't have an example of it at home,
Yeah.
or you're around people at a church maybe, or you're blessed enough to have a friend that models a great marriage, which oftentimes people don't.
Yeah.
It's there needs to be more great marriages in community because
Yeah.
it's so good for children and so good for one another, for a person to have a companion. So how does the process, so how could a parent, like let's say that I'm watching this and I'm going to go, if somebody wants to learn more about it for themselves, to just say, hey, is there anything that I could do better, right? I know we talked about, and it was to just email you at freedomfromgrief.com, right? And then from there, maybe you could talk to the person and walk them through like what this process looks like. So that's one as an adult, somebody that's, even for myself as a leader, I'm always learning like my personality type. I work this way, but there's a lot of other people that I need to lead. And instead of saying, well, if they're not like me, they're not going to be a top performer, more so being able to say, how could I develop a top performer that just has a different personality, different background, energy, different, different types of people. How could I do this right now to avoid making some of these mistakes with my kids?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, we actually, Dan and I do, we have a whole parenting, I think that might be what you guys talked about, are preparing kids for life. And we have an ebook that's called Building an Emotionally Healthy Home. And we've worked with couples, and I think once you do the work, to be able to do the work together is also, so powerful, because when you go through it, and this is a huge benefit as an adult, as a dad, when you go through the process of grief recovery to help get tools for yourself, you're going to automatically teach those to your kids, because you're no longer passing down unhealthy coping. And unhealthy coping, like you've brought it up a few times for boys, is usually, stop whining. You're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. You're going to cry, go to your room. Like, these are all things that get said, especially by dads who
you
think,
cry, I'm going to hit you again.
Yeah, who think I'm going to toughen up, But the truth, what happens is that you grow up, whether you're a young little boy or a little girl, knowing that my emotions are not to be trusted. They're not to be safe. I've worked with people who said, oh, as a kid, I hated my emotions. I did everything I could not to feel because they just got me in trouble. They got me hit. They got me isolated, sent to my room. Like, it's the opposite. And it's an amazing thing when you think about it. Like, as kids, we kind of we know how to process emotions. If you have a young kid, and as your kids get a little older, you'll see this even more and more, you give them the opportunity to say what they're feeling, and then all of a sudden they're off running and they're all happy again, like, because they're processing. Remember, unresolved grief is undelivered communication, and usually of an emotional nature. So when you give a young child the ability to what's like, a kid gets hurt by their friend, tell me about it, tell me what happened. They told me I was this, and instead of saying, well, they don't know, it's so easy to come to that defense and discount. Oh, I imagine that must have felt bad. How do you feel? Like, just allowing them, it hurt my feelings. Yeah, okay. Like, it's so simple. When you're little, it's so simple, but I think it illustrates that we lose that. And so as we become adults, we've learned all these ways to shut it down, because we feel like that's what I'm supposed to do. And especially if I'm a high performer, or if I want to be successful, or if I want to, fill in the blank, do whatever, then I've learned how to do it. But those emotions have to go somewhere. There's a really cool analogy that we use, and it's like, if you think of yourself, okay, I know I said we're a tree, but now I'm going to say you're a tea kettle. If you're a tea kettle, and if you're a tea kettle and you think about a tea kettle on a stove, and there's water in a tea kettle, and water represents emotion. And if you think about that water in a tea kettle, there's a lot of energy. When you turn up a fire and there's water in that tea kettle, that water starts swirling around. There's a lot of energy. And what happens when we've learned all these kind of intellectual ways, we're just sticking a cork in a tea kettle. Well, don't feel bad. If you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. All these things that we learn, we're just sticking a cork in there, and that water is just, so it's going to go somewhere. So it comes out in anger, it comes out in, little explosions when we're kids, temper tantrums. Those are all this unresolved grief. We don't know what we're feeling. We're just letting it out somehow. So we learn ways to take the cork out, which is ways that we drink or do something to feel better in the moment. And then we're just kind of on to doing the thing again the next day. It's just
the ebook that you said you guys have. What's the title of it?
It's called Building an Emotionally Healthy Home.
Okay. In that book, does it talk about like the marriage aspect and the parent aspect?
It talks a little bit about the marriage, but mostly it's about parenting. Mostly it's about with little kids, but we have quite a few. We have an ebook on the 6 myths of grief and loss. We have we have a few things on there that help with that too, but the ebook is mostly with parenting.
So tools for parents, one would be asking more questions instead of trying to solve the problem for them.
Yes.
Asking them more questions about how they feel through that. Any other like simple, actionable things that a parent can do to like deal with their kids when their kids are going through some hard moments, so that they, can deal with grief in like a healthy way, or learn how to deal with it in a healthy way?
Yeah, I know. I mean, and it's challenging for sure. It's going to challenge our patience and all of those things. But one of the things that's coming to my mind right now is a lot of times we'll ask our kids, like, what's wrong? And it can be said like, what's wrong? And just even the wording of that is, there's something wrong with me as
That's
a child.
so true. What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And the wording of that, instead saying, hey, you seem down, you seem sad. Tell me, what's going on, because just the wording of that is going to shut. And as a kid gets older, they start to learn, oh, I don't want anything to be wrong. I want to make dad happy. I want to make him proud of me. I want to make, I don't want to be depending, like you said, on the child's temperament, but not asking that question, not asking what's wrong or what's wrong now. Because a lot of times we can get, it's a lot, when you're going through kids at the younger ages too, but to have that patience and to just really try to recognize that you want to be a safe place for them to be honest, to be able to tell you. So, hey, you seem down. What's, is there anything? And then they if they don't say it in the moment, they'll come back. You want to have those times, because by the time they become teens, you want them to invite you in. You want them to recognize you as a safe place, as opposed to, I don't tell my parents anything and I'm going to go out and figure out, from social media or friends or all the ways to check out, because it's all out there.
Yeah. Anytime you feel you're going to be judged by somebody, you're going to hide parts of your life
Yes,
from that person.
definitely.
For sure. I'm not going to, they can't find out I did that. I'm going to, get in trouble. But on the flip side of it, my mom was really good at like, no, something's off. What's wrong? Like I can, and then you're like nothing. And then you're like, no, what's wrong? Well, this just happened today, and then she was really good about that. She is really good about that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
In terms of working with, last few questions, in terms of like working with business people, do you guys do anything with like business people that are leaders of organizations in terms of teaching them how to create a better environment of coaching people? Because when you coach in our business and doing life insurance retirement, we coach a lot of people, and there's they go through things.
Yeah.
I have a really good couple, and both of them lost their dads. And so, and they're partners of mine. They're great people, amazing people. They were very tight with their family. So, they took it in a very hard way.
Yeah.
But they're also leaders. So they're like, I got to perform.
Right.
I got to play hurt. And I even push, I talk about playing hurt all the time, because, we have organizations, and sometimes as a leader, if you turn off, you hurt your people. Like the people that you're guiding and mentoring, they need you to still be a leader for them, because they're counting on that,
Right.
And so it's like, how do I go through my own problems while not allowing it to affect me at work? Because if I do, I hurt the guys that I'm supposed to help. Do you guys do any kind of coaching there, or any kind of advice or direction?
That's a great question. My advice would be for them to definitely do grief recovery, because the other thing that I love about it is that you can be sure that this process is an action program. And I think that what happens is people start to feel better right away, because there's hope. There's hope that I'm getting tools to process this, and that allows you to show up, to kind of with that hope that you can, that I'm giving myself this time, and you have to do that for yourself. You can't just push it aside and 100% show up. It's, it's a weekly time, and then there's homework. And so by making that commitment to yourself, then you can show up better for your people. And you're able to even learn in the process how to be more of a safe person for other people. Because I think I understand what you're saying by play hurt is how you said it. But you also have to realize, but I've also got to make it a priority that I can process this, because I'm going to just get hurt worse if I, at some point, if I don't. I feel like what it can do is help you to continue to show up. But you're also going to have to say, I'm going to have to show up for me in this time as well, especially during a loss like that, and especially during that kind of a major loss in a life.
Yeah, because if a person's not emotionally there with their spirit, and they're truly not genuine, not that they're going to be happy going through it, because no one's going to be happy going through a loss.
Right.
But if they're dealing with it in a healthy way and working through it, they're going to feel overall better about the situation.
Yeah.
And instead of trying to force a face or force leadership, like, well, I'll do this externally, but on the inside I'm not there. People can always feel that. People can always tell. And then you're also looking, and you resent having to play hurt, versus looking at it as a great responsibility while you're guiding yourself through this process. So that makes a lot of sense. I know that you guys have a daughter, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, how have you taught her these tools? Is it just her? Is it teaching her the tool, or is it more so just being that example for her to duplicate, or both?
I laugh because I always think, goodness, she could teach this because she's been exposed to it her whole life. We have really tried our hardest to implement being a safe place, for her at home. So I would say both. To answer your question, I think that we've hoped that it's something that she's experienced, not perfectly for sure, not perfectly, right? But also she hears us talking about it all the time and, processing it. So she's 19 now, and she went away to college. And I think that that's one of the things that was so amazing for us and for her is when she went away, she experienced so much kind of like trauma because you're kind of thrown in with a bunch of 18-year-olds that have no idea how to do this thing. And what she saw was none of the girls, she was in a dorm with 5 other girls, did not have relationships with their parents, didn't talk to their parents about, they were always like, you're going to talk to them about that, like whatever it was, from her grades to relationships to all of those things. And it made her so aware. Like I remember her coming home and just saying, I'm so grateful, because you kind of think this is just normal, but it took her being out and recognizing how sad and all the choices that these girls were making because they didn't have the grounding. And she was like, well, of course I'm going to talk to my parents. And I think that was a really amazing testament for Dan and I too, to just be like, oh my gosh, we've, this has been our whole life's purpose, is to instill in her that we're safe and that she can come to us with anything because we're in her corner, and we're not here to judge her. We're not here to, we're here to help her, but also it's giving her the dignity to process her life, and we want her to invite us in for our advice. We're not going to give unsolicited advice. I mean, as a parent, we're going to give advice, right? But advice, if your child is asking you for it, it's going to go a lot further than when you just keep trying to give it to them and they just sort of don't listen. So it was a huge thing, for us when she kind of came with that realization of, oh my gosh, this actually isn't normal. Like a lot of people don't have this kind of a relationship with their parents. And it was a great moment for all of us.
I bet.
Yeah.
I look forward to that too.
Yeah.
But you guys have done a lot of work on yourselves too.
Yeah.
That is a place of value, because I think every parent wants their kid to come talk to them and seek them and search them out. But sometimes as a parent, you also don't have the answers because maybe you haven't done the work yourself,
right.
And so you're given the best advice you can, but it's limited.
Yeah.
And so, I read an article called All Pro Dad. My wife reads one. I don't know if it's All Pro Mom, but it's a daily article on like how to be a better parent or a better husband or a better wife. It takes work, it takes a lot of work. It's constant. It's never ending. It's becoming a better person overall in life, I think, is great. So my last question ties into, it's probably a deeper question. It may lead to more questions, but I know you brought up God, and when having a conversation with a friend, we were having dinner, and she's like, I'm just kind of like mad at God, because I didn't get enough time with my dad, and that's how she feels.
Yeah.
So you have both aspects of it. As a Christian, you have that aspect of your faith, but also as an expert in grief recovery, you have that aspect. What do you say to people in that situation? Because I'm sure you get a lot of people. They're like, why would God allow this to happen?
Oh, yeah, a lot. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the grief recovery method is not affiliated with any kind of religion. And I am a Christian, very strong, solid Christian, and I recognize now really strongly why it's that way. And it's because it has to be a safe place for people to feel however they're feeling. A lot of times at church, when I've mentioned, people will say, well, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. A lot of times people are very angry at God, whether they're Christian or not. They can be really wrestling with that. Totally makes sense. And it's not a sin or bad to be mad at God. It's normal and natural. And so we want it to be a safe place for people to be totally honest. They're never going to be told, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. That's not okay. It's 100% okay. And it's very natural to have feelings of you don't understand. How does God allow things that happen? Very hard things. So I think for me, when I went through the program of grief recovery, I had been a Christian just for 8 years. I became a Christian later, like as an adult. And I not only did I feel like the healing was so intense of what I experienced, but I also thought this is actually the heart of God. Because one of the things that we talk about every single week, we do commitments. And those commitments are that this is not a place for judgment. There's no judging, no comparing, and no minimizing. And I always say, I'm not here to fix you because you are not broken. I am here to listen with dignity and respect. And I think that the heart of God is not judgment, and it's not to be minimized. And so many times we can feel that way in church. I know I did. I did. And when I went through the process of grief recovery, I went, oh my gosh, this is actually I more experienced the heart of God in this process. And it totally strengthened my relationship with God, even though we never talked about God in the program. But I am a Christian, and I've worked with people who are and who aren't.
Sure.
And I feel with 100% confidence that on the other side, the healing that happens, a lot of it tends to get blamed on God. And the healing that happens in the process is you get a shift in your perspective. You get a shift in your perspective of how things are, because you get to get heard and you get to process your own grief and loss. And on the other side of that is a whole host of forgiveness, and it puts you in a different mindset. And a lot of times, just from the process, you no longer blame God. You have a different clarity. You have a different understanding. And so you can even use the tools to graph God. We recommend, like, we've taken people through that. Graph your relationship with God. It's one of the tools that we have so that you can get complete and really to deliver those communications that, God can handle. A lot of times in church settings, you get really shut down when it comes to these kinds of feelings and emotions. But I think just in the process of being heard, there's so much about that is, I think, really more closer to the heart of God that I even experienced in church.
And you said three things. You said judging, minimizing,
and comparing.
That's super helpful, because those three things right there, you can remember that. Like, don't judge the person, don't minimize what they're going through, don't compare it to something you've been through, because like you said earlier, did they talk to their dad every day or did they not talk? It's a different relationship altogether. Super helpful. Well, thank you for being on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I'm looking forward to going through the process myself. I'm going to see, what areas I can get better in, as a human being. And then maybe we'll do a part 2 after.
Yeah,
we go through
that
the
would be
process.
great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vicki.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, guys, whatever, I know a lot of us have gone through all kinds of things in life. Maybe it's with parents, maybe it's in a relationship, maybe it's different things that have just emotionally messed you up, and we don't like to deal with it. We don't want to talk about it. I remember when my mentor told me, you need therapy. That's what he said to me. You need therapy. And I'm like, I was pissed. I was like, who are you to tell me I need, like, what? Like, you need therapy? And I went and actually did therapy, and it was extremely helpful to take the time to get to know yourself, to take the time to have those conversations, to get feedback. And so I just don't think we do it enough. I think there's a stigma on grief or on therapy or on, dude, come on, that.
Yeah.
But then you look at all this the crap going on in people's life. Like you said, whether it's food or alcohol or spending money, shopping, any kind of distraction of unplugging from this place that you just, let's deal with it instead of keep coping with it. So I hope you guys got some value. If you guys would like to reach out to Vicki again, freedomfromgrief.com, and you can reach out, and hopefully some people connect with you. So thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yep. We'll see you on the next one, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.